They said it so quietly, I almost thought I imagined it, but I didn't, because the sting of it is still lodged under my skin like a splinter that will not work its way out. You smell like dust and death. That was my granddaughter's voice, low and cutting, not meant to be overheard by the others in the room, but sharp enough to slice right through me. A whisper dropped on the porch like poison. I leaned closer to her, and with the same breath that caught in my throat, I answered, not loudly, but firmly enough for her to hear. Better dust than the stink of your failure. She blinked, pulled back as though I had slapped her, but I did not raise my hand. I only stood in the doorway of the house I had once built with my own 2 hands, carrying the weight of years that she will never understand. That is how this begins, not with a polite greeting or a sentimental memory, but with a moment of humiliation wrapped in cruelty, a granddaughter who could not stand the sight of me, a woman of 82, still standing, still breathing, still capable of words that sting as much as hers. I live now in a small apartment on the edge of town, the kind of place people pretend not to notice when they drive by. A squat block of subsidized housing tucked behind a strip mall with a laundromat and a nail salon. I tell myself it is temporary, though at my age, nothing is temporary, not really. The walls are thin, and when the neighbor 2 doors down runs his television too loud, I can hear the rise and fall of voices from shows I do not watch. My own window faces west, so in the evening the sunlight slants in harsh and golden, filling the room with a kind of glow that makes even the old wood of my table seem briefly important. I sit by that window most afternoons, drinking tea, letting the dust settle in the corners where no one sweeps anymore, because who is coming to visit? No one. My daughter calls when she remembers, which is not often, and when she does, the voice is clipped, efficient, already busy with the next task before the conversation has even begun. My granddaughter never calls. She only appears, like she did on that porch, carrying her mother's sharpness and her own new brand of contempt, the kind that comes from youth convinced it will never wither. It was not always like this. Once I was a woman with a home full of sound, a piano in the parlor, students coming and going with nervous hands and bright eyes, learning the weight of Chopin and Schubert under my guidance. I was a mother too, a widow who did not collapse under grief, but instead worked twice as hard, teaching lessons in the morning and evenings, taking in mending to cover what the lessons did not pay. My daughter grew up with music in her ears and food on the table because I bent myself into shapes that could provide it. I thought that kind of sacrifice meant something permanent, a bond that could not be broken, but time has a way of unraveling even the tightest knots. What I gave became invisible, and what remained was only what they wanted to see. An old woman with thinning hair and the faint smell of lavender soap clinging to sweaters washed too often in communal machines. When I think of the word dust, I do not hear insult. Dust is memory. Dust is what lingers when everything else is gone. Dust is what remains after fire and storm. Yet when my granddaughter said it, she meant decay. She meant irrelevance. She meant that I am already half gone. She did not mean the kind of dust that floats golden in the sunlight and reminds you that air itself carries history. She meant the kind of dust people wipe away in disgust. But I am not something to be wiped away. I am not a forgotten shelf. I am not death, though death will one day come, as it will for her too, though she does not yet know it. At 82, I am not finished. My breath still fills my chest. My hands still remember the movements of scales. My mind still carries poems and recipes and memories that no book or phone can store. Yet standing on that porch, I saw clearly that to her, to them, I had already been erased, filed away as something inconvenient, a piece of furniture too heavy to move but too ugly to display. I do not write this as a plea for sympathy. I am not interested in pity. I am interested in truth, in saying out loud the words that were pressed into me that afternoon, when the child I once cradled like something sacred leaned close enough to spit contempt in my ear. That is who I am now, a woman whose own flesh and blood has mistaken her for a shadow, a relic, a reminder of something they would rather forget. And yet, in the middle of that shame, I answered back, because even in their dismissal, I have not lost my voice. I may smell of dust, but dust carries more stories than polished glass. And failure, the kind they dress up in new clothes and social media smiles, has its own odor, sharp and sour, impossible to disguise. So I sit here tonight by the light of the west-facing window, remembering that sentence, letting it echo. I have not been silenced. I have not been buried. The truth is this. They may think they have already mourned me, but I am still alive, and the story that begins with a whisper of death will end with my own choosing, not theirs. And if dust is all I have left, then I will gather it into my hands and show them what remains when the rest has blown away. The invitation never came, and that absence was louder than any spoken insult, louder even than the cruel whisper on the porch, because it carried within it the deliberate erasure of my existence. I had always known that my daughter liked to host events with a certain precision. Her table settings aligned to photographs clipped from magazines, her guest lists curated to flatter her ambition, her home arranged to look as if it had been designed, for publication rather than for living. Still, I believed that when her 50th birthday approached, I would at least receive a card, a phone call, some token acknowledgement that the woman who had raised her alone, who had bent her life around her daughter's survival and success, still mattered. Instead, I saw the party unfold from the edges of someone else's life, not through an invitation, but through the filtered square of a photograph posted online by a neighbor. A long table, glowing under fairy lights, wine glasses raised in celebration, a cake taller than any I had ever baked, and there she was, my daughter, smiling with a radiance that once belonged to me, surrounded by people who called her friend, colleague, family. I searched every corner of that photograph for a sign of myself, a chair saved for me, a shadow in the background, but there was nothing. I was not forgotten. I was omitted. I was deliberately excluded from the life I had built a foundation for, as if my presence would have spoiled the picture. The betrayal had a physical weight. I remember the way my hands trembled, not from age, but from recognition, the way my throat tightened around air that suddenly felt foreign. Betrayal is not always a shout or a slammed door. Sometimes it is the silence of an envelope that never arrives, the ache of watching other people live a life that should have included you. I sat in my chair by the window for hours after seeing that photograph, staring at the sky that was slowly dimming into evening, and I asked myself what crime I had committed to deserve this exile. Was it the sharpness of my advice when she was younger? The times I warned her against decisions she later made anyway? Was it the fact that I never remarried? That I did not bring a man into our lives who might have softened my edges and given her someone else to lean on? Or was it simply that I grew old, that my skin wrinkled, my voice wavered, my presence became a reminder of mortality she did not wish to see? I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps the guest list had limits. Perhaps she intended to invite me and forgot. But doubt dissolved quickly when I saw the second photograph, this time with my granddaughter front and center, holding a glass of champagne, wearing the smile of someone who believes she belongs, her arm around her mother's waist. In that image, the 3 generations that should have stood together were reduced to 2, and I was the missing piece. It was not oversight, it was decision. And in that decision, I felt myself cast out of their narrative, erased from the timeline of celebration, as though my presence would have been an embarrassment, a flaw in the carefully composed picture they wanted the world to see. The next morning, I did what I always do when the hurt threatens to harden into bitterness. I wrote a card. My handwriting is slower now, more labored, but still steady. I chose one with pressed flowers on the cover, soft lavender blooms that reminded me of the perfume I wore when my daughter was young, the scent she once called the smell of home. Inside, I wrote simple words. Happy 50th birthday, my darling. I am proud of you, always. With love, Mom. I slipped a small check into the envelope. Not much, but enough to buy herself something. A gesture of goodwill, a reminder that my care did not end just because theirs had. I mailed it the same afternoon, walking slowly to the post office, my knees aching but my resolve steady. I told myself that when she opened it, she would feel a pang of guilt, a tug of memory, something that would pull her back toward me. Days passed, then weeks, and no reply came, not even a message of thanks. The silence that followed was heavier than the first absence. The card had not been lost in the mail. It had been received, set aside, dismissed, as though my words were no longer necessary, as though my love were an outdated currency they no longer recognized. That was the moment when the fracture widened into something irreversible. Up until then, I could still pretend that distance was an accident, that perhaps their lives were simply too busy, that the cruel remark from my granddaughter, or the missed calls, or the absence at holidays were all part of the ordinary disarray of modern families. But the card with no reply was proof that I was no longer a participant in their story. I was a relic they had chosen to leave behind, and in that realization, something inside me shifted. Betrayal has a way of clarifying vision. You see not only what was taken from you, but also the scaffolding of all the smaller dismissals that led to this point. The ignored phone calls, the awkward pauses when I entered a room, the jokes about old-fashioned clothes, the way photographs of family gatherings grew increasingly full without me. It was not a single cruel remark or one forgotten invitation. It was a long, slow erosion, and the birthday card was simply the stone that finally broke free from the cliff. As I sat by the window, the unopened silence pressing against me, I knew that what had been broken would not be repaired, not with more cards, not with more checks, not with more patience. The truth had been revealed. They no longer saw me as necessary. They no longer saw me as theirs. And so the betrayal did not destroy me all at once. It hollowed me slowly, leaving space where something new would have to grow if I had the strength to plant it. I began to notice it not in sudden confrontations or explosive fights, but in the quieter spaces of everyday life, the kinds of moments most people overlook until they pile up high enough to bury you. It was in the way the phone would ring, and I would answer with hope, only to hear a voice hurried and distracted, promising to call back later, then never doing so. It was in the family group photos that appeared online, where everyone wore the same shade of coordinated clothing, as if they had been painted into a portrait of harmony, except for me, who was never included, never even asked if I wanted to come. It was in the way my granddaughter borrowed my old fur coat, one I had given away in a moment of downsizing, and posted a picture of herself draped in it with the caption, "Thrifted Ghost Vibes," words that made my chest ache with a recognition that I had become a costume, a joke, something to wear for effect, but not to love for truth. The small humiliations stacked one upon another, and while none of them screamed abandonment, together they built the unshakable truth that I was being erased, not suddenly, but gradually, like chalk washed away by slow rain. I tried to resist that knowledge. I tried to believe it was only my imagination, the paranoia of old age whispering in my ear. I invited them for tea. I baked the lemon cake my daughter used to love. I laid out the china cups I had saved for decades, each one still gleaming from careful hands that refused to let go of ritual. They accepted once, then canceled twice, and then stopped responding altogether. I watched the untouched cake grow stale under the dome of glass, cut a slice for myself, and found it tasted like ash. Even sweetness becomes bitter when it is meant to be shared and ends up consumed alone. The apartment grew quieter in those weeks, not because the world outside had hushed, but because my world within had been emptied of voices I once believed permanent. The silence was not soft, it was sharp, cutting at me when I tried to rest, reminding me of what had been withdrawn. Nights stretched long, the television flickering in a corner I rarely faced, and in those hours I heard the echo of my own heartbeat louder than the sound of any program. My body was present, my lungs filled and emptied with air, but in every other sense I felt myself being pressed into the margins. I was becoming invisible, not because I ceased to exist, but because the people who should have been my reflection had turned their faces away. It is a particular kind of cruelty, this slow erasure, because it never gives you the satisfaction of naming itself. There is no declaration, no farewell, no slammed door, just the ongoing diminishing of your presence until one day you realize you have become a shadow at the edge of their light. I stopped being asked for advice, even on things I knew well. I stopped being included in conversations about birthdays and graduations. When I did call, the answers were brief, polite, efficient, as though I were a telemarketer who had interrupted dinner rather than a mother, a grandmother, the very root of their lives. Even when my health faltered briefly, when my blood pressure rose and I mentioned it with the fragile hope that concern might awaken in them, I was met with perfunctory advice to take care and check in with the doctor, words without weight, spoken only to close the subject, not to open a space for care. There was one afternoon that carved itself into me more deeply than the others. I had walked the long half-mile to the grocery store, leaning on my cane, the late summer sun hot on my back, and I saw them by accident. My daughter, her husband, my granddaughter, all laughing together in the produce aisle as they compared melons and peaches. I froze at the end of the row, not because I feared approaching, but because I realized they had not told me they would be in town that day. They had not thought to invite me along on such a simple errand. They had not even considered that I might want to be part of something as ordinary as grocery shopping. They didn't see me, though I stood there long enough for my knees to tremble, long enough to know that if they had turned, they would have recognized me, and maybe they would have smiled, maybe they would have welcomed me into the circle. But they didn't, and I could not force myself to cross that distance. I turned away, my bag of rice and tea clutched like contraband, and walked home under the weight of an emptiness that had grown too familiar. This is what escalation looks like when it is quiet. You are not screamed at. You are not thrown out. You are simply not called in. Your name is not spoken. Your stories are not remembered. Your presence is not requested. You are left sitting at a table set for many, alone with your cooling tea. You are left checking the mail for envelopes that never arrive. You are left scrolling through photographs of people who carry your blood and your name, but not your face in their hearts. And the cruelty is not in what they say, but in what they do not say, the vast ocean of words withheld, the hugs not given, the moments not shared. I began to feel as though I were watching my own family through a pane of glass, unable to touch them, unable to remind them that I had been there at the beginning, that I had held them when they cried, that I had bled and sweated and worked to make sure they could stand where they stood. They walked past me in their lives as if I were already gone, a ghost moving through corridors of memory they no longer visited. And in that growing silence, I learned the truth of absence. It does not arrive all at once. It creeps in slowly. It fills the corners. It stains the air until one day you open your eyes and realize the people you love most have already left, even though their bodies remain only a town away. It began with the piano, though at first I did not recognize it as a turning. For months it had sat in the corner of my small living room, like a monument to a life I no longer believed I could touch. The keys dulled from disuse, the pedals tarnished, the bench piled with folded laundry, because I had convinced myself there was no one left to hear me play. One afternoon, restless and aching from the silence that had settled too heavily upon me, I sat down and pressed a single key. The sound was thin, hesitant, and I almost closed the lid again. But then my fingers remembered what my heart had not forgotten. I began to play scales, haltingly at first, then with more insistence, and by the time the sun dipped low in the window, I had played through half a book of Chopin etudes, stumbling, yes, but alive in a way I had not felt in years. It was not about who listened. It was about hearing myself again. The piano, stiff with neglect, began to breathe back with me, and in those notes I recognized that I was not yet finished. The very next day, a knock came at my door. It was the neighbor's child, a boy of 7 with large brown eyes, clutching a piece of paper that looked like a crude drawing of a treble clef. He asked me shyly if I could show him how to play something, because he had heard the music through the walls and told his mother he wanted to learn. I almost said no. I almost claimed that I was too tired, too old, too worn, but something in the boy's hopeful stare disarmed me. I let him in, sat him at the bench, placed his small fingers on the keys, and guided him through the opening notes of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. He beamed as if I had given him the moon. His laughter filled the room, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, the warm spark of purpose. Soon after, other children from the building began to knock, their parents whispering thanks as they sent them in. I charged nothing, for I wanted no money. I wanted only the sound of life to return to my home. Within weeks, the room that had once smelled of dust and loneliness was thick with energy, with children's voices fumbling through scales, with laughter, and the occasional squeal of frustration when fingers missed their places. I did not mind the mistakes. I welcomed them, because each wrong note was proof of presence, of breath, of human connection. And slowly, I began to change. I stopped sitting by the window, waiting for phone calls that never came. I stopped measuring my worth by the silence of my family. Instead, I measured it by the eagerness of a boy who came early to every lesson, or the determination of a girl who brought her mother's old keyboard and practiced in the hallway so she would not lose her place. They called me Miss, or sometimes Grandma, even though they were not related, and the word, spoken without irony or bitterness, soothed the wound my own blood had carved. One evening, after a lesson, one of the mothers lingered behind and asked me why I did not share my music more widely. I laughed, dismissing the idea, but she told me her brother could help me record simple videos. Skeptical, I agreed, and a week later she brought him by with a small camera. He filmed me as I played an old waltz, my hands slower but still steady, my expression solemn but alive. He uploaded it for me, and I thought no more of it until days later when he showed me the screen. Strangers had listened. Strangers had left comments. One wrote, "This sounds like my grandmother's house. Thank you." The words brought tears to my eyes because they recognized what my own family refused to see, that I still had something to offer, that I was not merely dust, that I carried within me a sound that could cross walls and years. I began to record more pieces, nothing extravagant, just fragments of the music I had taught all my life. I called the channel Dust and Music, not as an insult to myself, but as an act of reclamation. Dust, yes, because I was old, because I lived among the remnants of decades, but also music, because I still had voice, still had spirit, still had breath. The videos did not make me famous. They did something quieter and more profound. They made me visible again. People commented from far places, sharing how the songs reminded them of their mothers or grandmothers, how they cried while listening, how they found comfort in the gentle imperfection of my playing. For the first time in years, I felt connected to a world beyond my family, and it was enough to remind me that my existence did not require their validation. The shift was not loud or triumphant. It came like a dawn, slow and steady, until I realized the room no longer felt empty when I entered it. The air was filled with echoes of children's voices, with the resonance of music, with the weight of recognition from strangers who valued what I carried. I had been waiting all my life for my family to turn and look at me again, to see me as they once had, to love me as I had loved them. Now I understood that waiting was another form of burial, and I was not ready to be buried. The piano had reminded me that I was still alive, and the children, the neighbors, the voices from distant places confirmed it. My daughter and granddaughter could dismiss me, but I would not dismiss myself. I would not fold into invisibility. I would play, I would teach, I would speak, and in those acts, I would carve out a life that was my own, even if they never returned to share it. That was the beginning of my turning, the moment when silence no longer felt like suffocation, but like space into which I could pour new sound. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was not revenge. It was simply the slow, deliberate choice to live again, to step out of the waiting room of abandonment and into the modest stage of my own making. And in that choice, I began to feel the weight of betrayal lift, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer defined me. What defined me now was the piano, the children, the music, and the truth that dust does not disappear when ignored. It lingers, it floats, it settles into the air, carrying with it the particles of a life still lived, still resonant, still mine. The quiet strength I had begun to gather through the piano, through the voices of neighborhood children, and through the strange comfort of strangers who listened online, was tested sooner than I expected, because the past has a way of sniffing you out just when you begin to breathe more freely. It started with a letter, slipped beneath my door one morning, not by the postman, but by Joyce, the neighbor across the hall, who had taken to checking the shared mailbox when my knees were swollen and stairs too unkind. She held it gingerly, as if it might be hot to the touch, and said only, "It's from Wilmington," before shuffling back to her apartment. The envelope bore my daughter's handwriting, the same careful loops I remembered from her school assignments decades ago, but sharpened now, almost severe. My fingers trembled as I opened it, not from weakness, but from dread, and inside I found not warmth, not apology, not even acknowledgement of what she had done, but pages of neat accusation. She accused me of disappearing, of causing distress during their vacation, of abandoning the family without warning. She described Lisa crying every night, and the grandchildren confused, as if my absence were a crime, rather than the inevitable response to years of dismissal. There was no mention of the lounge at the airport, of the hours I had waited alone once before, no admission of their orchestrated neglect, no recognition of the silence they had built brick by brick around me. The letter ended with a line that struck me harder than any insult. "We are willing to talk, but only if you are ready to be reasonable." Reasonable. As if decades of giving, of raising her alone, of paying bills, of cooking meals, of offering everything I had been unreasonable. As if my silence now was tantrum rather than survival. I folded the letter slowly and placed it back in the envelope, sliding it into the drawer beside my bed. I did not answer, not then, not later. I had learned that replying to lies often makes them stronger. Instead, I returned to my piano, to the voices of the children, to the quiet hum of my own choosing. Yet the letter lingered in the air like smoke, and it was only the first of many intrusions. A week later, my granddaughter appeared at my door, her face tight with an expression she thought was concern, but I recognized as strategy. She did not hug me. She did not even step fully inside. She glanced around the apartment as though inspecting a property for sale and then said, "Mom thinks you'd be better off somewhere with more care. There's a place near the beach, nicer than this. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." I laughed, not loudly but deeply, and asked her, "Not have to worry or not be seen?" She did not answer, only shrugged in that way of the young who think they have already measured the worth of an old body. She sat for a few minutes, speaking in vague generalities about options and comfort, but I could see in her eyes the same impatience her mother carried, the desire to manage me, to place me somewhere tidy, out of sight, but close enough to claim credit for duty. When she left, she leaned closer, her breath smelling of sugared coffee, and whispered, "You smell like dust and death." It was then I gave her my answer, steady and unwavering. "Better dust than the stink of your failure." Her eyes widened, her lips parted, but she said nothing more, only left with the same air of dismissal she had arrived with. The visits became more frequent after that, though not from her. Lisa herself appeared at the cafe where I had begun to play on Saturday afternoons, standing awkwardly near the pastry case, pretending to study the chalkboard menu while keeping me in the corner of her eye. I continued wiping counters, filling sugar caddies, refusing to grant her the stage she wanted. Eventually, she approached, her smile brittle, her tone low. "Martha," she said, as though addressing a stranger at a reception, "can we talk?" I gestured to a booth in the back, and she sat, her posture rigid, her hands folded too neatly. She began with excuses. The boarding call at the airport had been rushed, the children cranky, her husband distracted. She claimed they had not meant to leave me, that they thought I was behind them, that the hours of waiting were a mistake. I looked her directly in the eye and said, 8 hours, Lisa, 8 hours, and not one call, not one message, not one question at the gate. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She fiddled with her manicured nails, her silence confirming what I already knew. Finally, she reached into her purse and slid an envelope toward me. "This isn't from me," she said. "It's from Kieran. He misses you." That was the only truth in her mouth, and because it was about him, I took the envelope. I did not thank her. She left before finishing her coffee, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume, the same kind she wore when she wanted to pretend everything was under control. Inside the envelope was a short note from my grandson, the only one who had ever come to me without being asked, the only one who once spent an entire afternoon helping me paint a birdhouse bright red. The note was simple. Grandma, Dad, and Lisa are frantic. They say you've vanished. No one knows where you are. I've been checking every day. I miss you. Please let me know you're okay. At the bottom was his new number. I read it twice, then folded it back into the paper, holding it in my lap for a long time. That letter, unlike the others, softened me. Not because it erased the betrayal, but because it reminded me that not all blood turns cold. I did not call him immediately, but I kept the number close, tucked into my nightstand like a seed waiting for spring. But the escalation did not stop with letters and visits. Soon, a man in a suit appeared at the cafe, standing stiffly by the counter until my shift ended. He introduced himself as Derek Sorensen, a lawyer representing my daughter and her husband. He spoke in the tone of someone rehearsed in false concern, telling me that they were deeply worried about my well-being, that they wanted to ensure I was safe, that perhaps it was time to discuss next steps regarding my assets. I folded my apron neatly, placed it on the counter, and looked him squarely in the eye. Tell them I am not a pet they forgot to pick up. My well-being is excellent, and my assets are none of their business. There are no next steps unless I take them. He shifted uncomfortably, cleared his throat, tried again, but I walked past him and out into the sunlight without another word. Arthur, the widower who had begun frequenting the cafe, was waiting outside, his cane resting lightly against his leg. He asked if I was all right. I smiled and said, yes, because I will not let anyone convince me otherwise. Not long after, my story appeared in the local newspaper, though not told by me. The headline read, "Missing Matriarch. Family pleads for grandmother's safe return." There was a photograph of me from years ago, holding a pie at some holiday, smiling without showing teeth. In the article, my daughter was quoted, "She vanished without a word. We just want her safe." Lisa added, "She's vulnerable. We fear something has happened. She's not the type to do something like this." Vulnerable, not the type. I laughed aloud when I read it, a sharp, startled sound that turned the heads of those nearby. It was obscene, this performance of concern, this rewriting of truth into a story where I was frail, confused, and lost, rather than deliberate, clear, and choosing. They wanted the world to believe they were victims of my disappearance, not perpetrators of my erasure. They wanted sympathy for the pain of being abandoned by a mother, when in fact it was I who had been left behind years ago, one silence at a time. I kept the clipping, not for sentiment but for proof, a reminder of how people only start worrying when they can no longer use you. They called me dust, they called me death, they painted me as fragile, but what frightened them was not that I was weak, it was that I was free. Free from their control, free from their version of reality, free from the leash of obligation they had mistaken for love. The pressure they applied only sharpened my clarity. Each letter, each visit, each public display of false worry reminded me that I was right to step away, that I was right to choose a life that was mine, that I was not finished simply because they had written me out. And yet, even as I burned Adam's letter, piece by piece over the sink, even as I sent a short note to Lisa, 3 lines that said, "I know what you did. I am not angry. I am not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I have started mine." I held on to Kieran's number, and eventually I dialed it. His voice cracked when he answered, uncertain at first that I would speak. But I did, and in that moment the escalation met its equal, not in confrontation, not in revenge, but in the quiet affirmation that love can survive, even in the ruins of betrayal. The moment of decision did not arrive with thunder or lightning. It came with the steady scrape of the piano bench against the wooden floor and the knowledge that the instrument, which had carried my voice through decades, no longer belonged to me in the way it once had. For months, it had been the anchor that kept me steady, the vessel through which I reminded myself that my hands were still capable, my ears still tuned, my spirit still alive. But the time had come for it to move on, not because I was finished, but because I had to prove to myself that I was not chained to relics. I had received an offer from a young couple, two women who were opening a small cafe across town that would feature live music and art. When they first visited, they ran their fingers reverently across the worn wood, whispering that it felt like history, that it smelled like every story their grandmother had ever told them, and I saw in their eyes the same hunger I once carried as a young teacher. I decided in that instant that the piano would be theirs, not as a loss, but as a gift, a passing of fire from one generation to another. The day of the move, I stood in the doorway as the movers carefully hoisted the instrument onto a dolly, the straps tight around its frame, their faces straining with effort. Each groan of wood sounded like memory breaking, but I did not weep. Instead, I touched the lid one final time, whispering a silent thank you for the decades it had given me. When the truck pulled away, carrying it toward its new home, I felt a strange emptiness in my apartment, but also a surprising lightness, as if I had made room not for absence, but for something unimagined. With the money I received, not extravagant but fair, I made a decision that no one could take from me. I went to the bank, withdrew most of it in cash, and then walked to a small print shop, where I ordered the first 100 copies of a manuscript I had been writing quietly at night. The manuscript was not a diary and not a memoir, but a guide, a declaration, a testament. I titled it, No One's Grandmother, A Guide to Outliving Invisibility. In its pages, I wrote not of recipes or lullabies or polite advice, but of the deep knowledge that comes from betrayal, of the long silence of being erased, of the courage it takes to choose oneself after being told for years that one's worth is measured only by service. I wrote of the loneliness that tastes like ash and the freedom that follows when you stop asking for permission to exist. I wrote of the piano, the children, the letter from Kieran that softened what might otherwise have hardened entirely into bitterness. Each page was raw, imperfect, but mine, and when I held the first printed copy in my hands, the weight of it was heavier than any insult, more permanent than any whisper. I mailed one copy directly to my granddaughter. I did not include a note, no explanation, no apology, no plea. I wanted her to hold it in her hands, to feel the heft of my voice bound in paper, to realize that the woman she dismissed as dust and death had written herself into permanence. Whether she read it or threw it away was her choice, but the act of sending it was mine. Another stack of copies I donated to the community center down the street, slipping them quietly onto the table where people left free pamphlets and local newsletters. Within a week, I saw one in the hands of a woman waiting for the bus, her eyes scanning my words as though they might matter, and I realized they did. They mattered because they existed, and that was enough. The climax of my story was not loud confrontation, but an irreversible act of ownership. I had given away the piano, not as surrender, but as transformation, and I had taken the money to carve my name into something that could not be ignored. My daughter could write her letters of accusation. My granddaughter could whisper her cruelty. The newspaper could paint me as vulnerable and lost, but none of them could erase a book sitting in the hands of strangers, carrying my name on the cover. It was not revenge. It was reclamation. It was dignity bound in ink. When I walked home after dropping off the copies, the air was cold, autumn curling into winter, and the sky had that gray heaviness that makes every breath feel weighted. I wrapped my coat tighter, but inside I was burning steady. For so long, my life had been about waiting, for calls, for invitations, for acknowledgement. But with each step, I realized there was nothing left to wait for. The act had been done. The piano was gone, the book was real, my voice had crossed the boundary of silence. I reached my apartment, unlocked the door, and stood for a moment in the emptiness where the piano had once sat. The space looked bare, but to me it looked open, ready. I brewed myself tea, poured it into the chipped blue mug I had kept since my first year of teaching, and sat by the window as the sun disappeared behind clouds. The city lights flickered on one by one, indifferent and constant, and I felt myself part of that rhythm, small but steady, unignorable. I thought then of my granddaughter, holding my book, perhaps scoffing, perhaps frowning, perhaps secretly reading in the quiet of her room. I thought of my daughter, hearing from her lawyer that her attempts at control had failed. I thought of the strangers online who had listened to my music and now perhaps would read my words. And I thought of Kieran, whose letter had reminded me that even in families that turn their backs, one soul can still look forward with honesty. None of them could change what I had done. None of them could take away the fact that I had written myself back into existence. That was the climax of my story. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, not revenge, but the irreversible act of saying, I am here, I remain, I will not be erased. When the dust finally settled, when the piano was gone, and the first copies of my book had left my hands and found their way into the palms of strangers, I discovered that peace did not arrive like a parade with banners and noise. It arrived like a quiet breath at the end of a long walk, the kind of breath that fills you without struggle, the kind that reminds you that you are still alive. My apartment was smaller now, emptier without the piano's hulking presence, but in that emptiness there was space for light to spill freely across the floor, for quiet to feel like rest rather than punishment. I had expected to feel loss when the instrument was carried away, but instead I felt expansion, as though I had opened a door inside myself that had been locked for too long. The children still came by sometimes, tapping on the door with drawings or thank you notes, and I still recorded little fragments of music on the keyboard someone had donated after hearing my story. But the piano itself was not the heart of me. It had only been a vessel. The heart of me was still beating, steady and deliberate, and now it beat in a rhythm of its own choosing. Not long after, a letter came from Kieran, this time in his careful, uneven script, not typed, not polished, just written by hand on lined paper torn from a notebook. He wrote that he had read my book cover to cover, that he kept it folded into his backpack and took it out when the world made him feel small. He said he did not care if the others mocked him for siding with me, that he knew I had been treated unfairly, that he remembered every moment we had shared when he was little, building birdhouses and baking bread, and that those memories were the kind of inheritance no one could take away. I read that letter slowly, again and again, until the paper grew soft at the folds, and then I tucked it into the drawer where I had once hidden my daughter's accusations. It felt like a different kind of ending, not bitter, not triumphant, but honest, a reminder that love does not always vanish, even when families fracture. In the weeks that followed, I walked through the neighborhood more often, my steps unhurried, my cane tapping a steady rhythm on the pavement. The air grew colder, the trees stripped bare, but I found beauty in the branches outlined against the winter sky, beauty in the way light clung to the edges of rooftops at dusk. Sometimes Arthur would join me, leaning on his own cane, and we would walk side by side in silence, two old souls who no longer needed to fill the air with chatter to feel companionship. Other times Joyce would wave from her window, calling me in for soup or tea, her house cluttered but warm, her presence a reminder that chosen company can be just as rich as blood. I no longer felt the hollow ache of being unseen, because I had stopped measuring myself by the blindness of others. One night, I sat by the window with a blank card and wrote not to my daughter, not to Lisa, not even to Kieran, but to myself. "Dear me," I began, "you waited too long for others to give you permission to matter, but you learned in the end that permission was never theirs to give. You did not lose them. They let go, and you, finally, let go back. Look at the life that opened when you did. Well done." I folded the card and taped it to the inside of my dresser drawer, hidden behind recipe cards and old photographs, not for anyone else to read, but for myself, for the days when doubt might creep in again. That note is my anchor now, the voice I trust most. The resolution of my story is not loud, and it is not bitter. It is the simple act of sitting in a chair by the window with tea cooling beside me, of knowing that I am not waiting for a phone call that may never come, of feeling the air around me, full of memory and possibility rather than emptiness. It is the knowledge that dust, once considered an insult, is also proof of survival, the fine layer that settles only on what has endured. And I have endured. I will continue to endure. To any woman who might hear these words and recognize her own silence, I would say this: do not wait for the perfect sign. Do not wait for those who turned their backs to turn again. Be your own sign. Choose yourself. And when you do, you will find, as I did, that peace comes not from being remembered, but from remembering yourself.